morning, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome back. Today, meekness is our jumping off point because that's where we left off last week, is with the gentleness of God we talked about in Beatitude number 3. So I want to go back and recap something that was really important from last week, and that is that, remember, meekness is not weakness. Meekness is not weakness. It means that we're able to, beginning with Beatitude 1, remember, we're going to go back and recap all of those, but this is a process. So it means that we are able to orient ourselves to others that in a way that mirrors that meekness or that gentleness of God that we talked about last week. Remember that we explored the idea that humility and meekness are perfect attributes of God. So I had a little conversation, David and I had a conversation before we started this morning about the idea of perfect versus imperfect, and if these are things that we can perfectly do in this life, can we attain the perfection of Christ in this life? Do we follow this as the roadmap, the Christian identity card, as Pope Francis calls it, sort of the roadmap to perfection, with the expectation that we will receive the fullness of grace in our eternal life, right? But that this is a way to get there. So I thought that was an interesting conversation to think about. Is this something that is attainable for us in its fullness of perfection in this life? Because humility and meekness and what we're going to talk about today, this thirsting and hungering for righteousness. Wait, or is it justice? We'll talk about that too. That's also an ideal. Right? It's something to strive toward. It is an ideal. So I can say this at a minimum. At a minimum, I can tell you this: we're capable of progress. Capable of progress. Right? And thank God that He counts our baby steps as miles. Right? I mean, thank God for that. So meekness simply means, remember from last week, means that our hearts are softened, not hardened, as you hear spoken of so many times in sacred scripture, the hardness of the hearts of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Those biblical examples that Jesus gives. Hard hearts are caused by what? Going back to Beatitude number 1. What is the foundational sin that causes our hearts to harden? It's pride. That's right. It's pride. Or thinking ourselves somehow better than others, which closes us off from others. So this whole journey that we have been on so far, from Beatitude number 1, 2, 3, and now 4. And for those of you that didn't join us for 1 through 3, there's no review. I'm sorry. No, I'm kidding. Actually, I do a little recap, so you'll sort of see how we ended up where we are. But this whole journey has been to orient ourselves outward, to turn ourselves outward, away from self, and to begin to become more like Christ. We were talking about, to become more like Christ. That's why, actually, I used anger last week as an example when we did the exploration of the third Beatitude, blessed are the meek. I used that as anger as an example because to be meek does not mean what the world thinks it means, right? It doesn't mean to be weak. It doesn't mean to be a doormat. It doesn't mean to never have a posture of standing up for yourself. Or to want the correction of an abuse. It doesn't mean that. It also doesn't mean to never become angry. And anger is something that is often used. The fathers did this. If you read St. Augustine's commentary in its fullness on the Gospel of Matthew, he uses anger as an example in his discussion of meekness too. This is something that I think we naturally are drawn to as sort of, we think of it as an opposite almost, when it's not. It's not. So that's why we used anger last week as a way of looking at how we react as human beings, but how we are to always mirror the meekness of God, which is gentleness, even in our anger. Right? Even in our anger. So today we're doing, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. And some translations say, for they shall be satisfied. it's interesting that the word here is righteousness. And I had to do a little research about this. Okay? I put in extra time for you guys. Actually, it was my own curiosity that took me down a very long rabbit hole. That happens to me sometimes. Righteousness, or is the word justice. Have you ever seen it translated as justice? So I was really curious about this. Many times you see the Beatitude written this way: blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, and occasionally you see it as justice. So I was super curious about which translations used which word, so that I could possibly, what I thought it was going to be is a Catholic Protestant thing, right? That's what you think automatically. Well, it's the Protestants, when they translated the Bible, they did this. No, no. It actually, as I said, took me down a very long rabbit hole, but I did get to what I think might be the root of some of it. And well, I almost never came out of that rabbit hole, by the way. This was hours, but fortunately for you, I've condensed it to just a few minutes. Fortunately for you. So, if you want to get back to the original word, what do you go to?
Greek and Hebrew?
The Greek. Go to the Greek because, right, that's the language of the New Testament. Matthew is Beatitudes are the original language of Greek. And so you go to that word, and it is a derivative of a Greek word, dikaios. Dikaios is the word. Okay? So that's a great place to start. And you would think it would end there for me, right? No. So that means, guess how that's translated? Justice or righteousness. This is what you find in the biblical commentaries, okay? And I went back to about the 16th century to see if I could find this where this happened. So we have two different renditions of the very same Greek word. Two very different, seemingly very different, but as you'll see, I think not at all. Do you know that y'all know that there's a list published by the USCCB of the biblical translations that are approved, really, that have the imprimatur that you can use to study and to read? Y'all know that, right? So there is, for us, the New American Bible Revised Edition, which is the NABRE, New American Bible Revised Edition, NABRE, or there is also the Oxford translation, the New Revised Standard Version, or the NRSV Catholic Edition, right? So I thought, okay, both of these translations, let me go to them. They both use the word righteousness, okay? The same word, incidentally, that is used in John Wycliffe's English Bible of the 14th century. Y'all know John Wycliffe? He's called the Morning Star of the Reformation. He's the one they dug up in 1387 and burned him at the stake. Yes, at the Council of Constance. Anyway, that's another story. If y'all want a history lesson, we could talk about that sometime. John Wycliffe's English translation of the Bible uses that word in the 14th century. There is the King James Version, of course. Actually, let's back up from that too. There's William Tyndale's English translation of 1522 that uses the same word, righteousness. It is the word that's used in the King James Version of 1611 is righteousness. All of whom rendering that Greek word as righteousness. Okay, working from the original Greek. All of these people working from the original Greek. So anyone know what Latin translation is still in use by the church? It was affirmed at the Council of Trent and also again in 1979 by Pope St. John Paul II as our having primacy of place. It's not the official translation of the scriptures for the church. We don't have that, but it has primacy of place. What is it? Oh, you've been paying attention. Good. Okay. Yeah, St. Jerome's Vulgate. That's right. The Vulgate of St. Jerome. Now, Jerome translates, obviously, he's working from the original Greek too, and he's translating into Latin. Okay? So St. Jerome translates that word, dikaios in the Greek, he translates it into Latin as justitium, which is justice. He translates it as justice. Justice, from the Latin, justice is the direct English word. Does that make sense? Do you see why I lost hours of my day doing this? And you just got the condensed version. So I think then, but what came out of this is really good because I think it's a fair question to ask, isn't it? It's a really fair question to ask. Does this make a significant difference in our understanding of this beatitude? Depending on what word you use. Does it make a significant difference? Are justice and righteousness the same thing? Well, clearly they are, right? Someone thought so. But what do you think when you hear the word justice?
Fair.
Fair, okay? Fair. This is always fun. I do this to my philosophy students too. What is justice? Fair, law, I got law, okay?
It's like the right way it should go.
I'm sorry, what, David?
The right way it should go.
The right way it should go, okay? Restitution.
Moral conduct.
Moral conduct. Oh, this is so good. Okay. What else? Throw some other word salads at me. I love it. Just. Justice is just. Say, is that fair, law? Anybody else have a word? Okay. So what then is your understanding of righteousness? What is that word? When you hear righteousness, what do you think?
Far out man.
Far out, man?
Doing God's will.
Doing God's will.
Moral.
Moral. Okay. Anybody else? Are you having a little trouble? I mean, is it
Good.
it's good, right? Though, right? Okay, it is good. Righteousness is good. Okay. Is it almost as if you could think of justice as being, we think about justice maybe as being more community, and righteousness as being a more individual attribute, maybe?
Definitely.
Because that's kind of what struck me. Is maybe we think of justice in a more community, kind of a global sense, and righteousness might be more individual. Well, here's the thing, and y'all do know that in addition to being a historian, I also do teach philosophy, and I love this stuff. This is the, if you ever complained about hearing too much history in this adult faith formation series, you might have to complain about philosophy too, because that's my other love. And so this is something I actually can come at from a perspective of Greek philosophy, and I think it might help you. I really do think it might help you, because remember, truth is universal. So just because Plato said it doesn't mean it's not true, right? Truth is truth. Truth is truth. And in Plato's Republic, how many of you ever had to read that? Plato's Republic. 3 people. You read it, you just don't remember. I promise you. You had to read part of it. It is in the canon of Western literature. Everybody has had to at least be exposed to it at some point. But justice in Plato's Republic, okay, so Plato's Republic is the ideal society. Remember, he is writing about the perfect world. The Republic is the perfect place. This is where perfection has been attained. This is how everything is ordered. He lays out what are the ideals that human beings can strive for if you live in that part of you that pulls you toward virtue, that you can live these ideals. Okay, they're all attributes of the good, as he calls it, the agathon, the good. And justice is one of these ideals. Okay, have I lost you yet? You with me still? Y'all with me still? In Plato's Republic, what word does he use for justice? He's a Greek philosopher, by the way. Now you know why I lost hours. What word does he use for justice, do you suppose? Dikaios. The same Greek word. Okay? So it's interesting that the problem with vocabulary, we touched on this in here before, is again our modern society. I dare say that 3 centuries ago, 50 people sat in a room and debated about the meaning of these 2 different words. You know, it is a problem I think unique to our modern kind of condition. We rarely call someone righteous to refer to just, do we? We wouldn't use that word. Righteous to refer to something that's just. We use the term justice to refer either to our system of law or to a higher principle or perfection of God, the way that Plato uses it in the Republic. But we don't use the word righteous to describe a verdict in a court of law, do we? So I think this is a modern issue of semantics. Think of this, looking ahead. The 8th Beatitude in the same translation reads, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake." Okay? For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The Greek word translated as righteousness is again the same Greek word, dikaios. Yet justice is again maybe better for our purposes there. So you know we're going to be revisiting this Greek word at the end, right? When we get to Beatitude number 8, we'll be talking about that word again. Can we make them synonymous for our purpose this morning? The answer I need from you is yes. Thank you. Okay. Make them synonymous for our purposes this morning. I think we have to in this context because it is both and. It is a both and thing that I think you're going to see. If you think of righteousness as being right. Right is also a perfect attribute of God only. Correct? Right. If you think about right, it's also a perfect attribute of God. God judges rightly, God acts rightly, God acts perfectly, and according to his nature, which is always right. Okay, always good. Because it is always good, it is always just. It is always just. Is justice something that we can even begin to contemplate perfectly?
No.
Can we contemplate it perfectly?
No.
What does justice mean to you? I heard all sorts of answers. Okay? I heard all sorts of answers. God treats everyone rightly, justly, perfectly. Do we? Can we? Obviously, it's having to think about it over there. I don't know. Depends on the day, right? Before man's pride, going back to Beatitude number 1, before man's pride turned him away from God, before pride, before sin entered the creation, what was the created order? Perfect. Did y'all get that word?
Yep.
Perfect. It was perfect. To seek justice, therefore, is to seek a restoration of that order. I want y'all to hear this. That's philosophy 101 too. To seek justice is to seek a restoration of the perfect order. Okay? That's the definition of justice. Would any of you have thought that when you came in here this morning? When I asked you what justice was, how many of you would have said, oh, it's to seek a perfect restoration of the order? No. And the reason that this is justice, is to seek a restoration of the order, is because so much of what we as humans do damages the order. The same order we think we are restoring. Do you remember last week how we talked about this with anger? How in our meekness, in our gentleness, we're still going to get angry. But the key is that we don't use our anger to enter our own hearts and become an accomplice to the very thing that we think we want to correct. This is kind of that same lesson, is that justice, to seek true justice, perfect justice, means a restoration of the order. This is an example I often use, guys. I do, because the justice as being the attribute of God, in Greek philosophy, it's an attribute of the good, the one, the perfect, the beautiful, as Plato calls it, the source of all that is. It exists only in the realm of perfection, in its perfect state. It is by moving out of self, going back, three Beatitudes, and it is a universal truth that's spoken by Plato. We can talk about Plato in Christian adult faith formation class. Do you know why? Even though he's a pagan philosopher? St. Augustine baptized him pretty clearly in his works. So did St. Paul. I mean, our Christian faith is Platonic. So it's okay. You don't have to report me. All right, we're talking about Plato's philosophy this morning. But it's what Christ himself tells us. Okay? So we have the model of Christ sitting on that gentle slope overlooking the Sea of Galilee. We've talked about so many times. Teaching us, happy are those who hunger and thirst after justice. Put that word there. Justice. Who hunger and thirst after justice. It is in the seeking, remember, that we can begin to approach the ideal. And this is hard. When I asked you a while ago what you think justice means, how many of you entertained, even for a moment, the thought, that justice is people getting what they deserve? You might not have said it out loud, but somebody in this room, thank you for being honest. Now I can't stop. So you may have entertained it just for a minute, but you wouldn't say it, right? Justice is people getting what they deserve.
Moral justification.
So this is how people justify, for instance, capital punishment. If you understand what perfect justice is, then you cannot make an argument for capital punishment. Or the cruel treatment, for instance, of another person, imprisoned. Torture. If you think about things like that. Remember that justice seeks a restoration of the order, not more damage. You don't restore the order by creating another wound. Right? It's a higher call. It's a higher call. This perfection that Jesus calls us to. To act in revenge is to create another wound. That can hardly be justice. And it's something else, right? We can call it something else, but let's call it what it is. Don't do that and call it justice. I'll give you a hint. Another hint. The flip side of justice, the flip side of the coin. What's the other side of the coin?
Injustice.
Somebody said it. What's the other side of the coin? Mercy. Mercy. The next beatitude, by the way. In case you're not getting it yet, these go in a particular order, even though we did find St. Jerome actually ordered them differently too. You remember, we can't talk about one of these, any one of the 8. You can't talk about one of them without talking about all of them. You can't choose one that you're going to live and not live all of them. So the next one in the series, the 5th one, is in the 6th week, because that's how I got this confused. I won't be here next week, so it's the 6th week, the 5th beatitude, is mercy. Mercy. There is no justice without mercy. Do you understand why? Because it doesn't mean getting what people deserve. That's not what justice means. And I guarantee if you went away and thought about this and applied this to yourself, if justice means getting what you deserve, you better pray there's another side of the coin. Right? It means what it takes to restore God's perfection. Restore the perfect order of God. How can one be in a relationship with God, filled with God, from Beatitude 1, 2, 3, and not seek justice in the world? Think about it later in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 25. This is where Jesus declares that all we have done or have not done to the least of our brothers and sisters, and you used this morning, Father, this homily. Anybody at 8 o'clock had heard? That was so moving. Thank you so much for that this morning. This is Matthew 25, where he says that basically all we have done or have not done to the least of our brothers or sisters has been done or not done to him. So seeking justice, even imperfect as we are, is a measure of our relationship with God. To seek it, To hunger and thirst for this. And think about the imagery there, to hunger and thirst. This is a deep desire, right? To hunger and thirst. To seek it. St. Therese of Lisieux said it this way, I don't want to be a saint by halves, right? It's a deep yearning, this hunger and thirst. It's to let oneself seek God in a way that is completely submissive. Right? To hunger and thirst. Not to adjust God to what we are, but to adjust ourselves to Him. And as we've talked about in all of these, it also has to mean, therefore, that because none of these are lived individually, they're all lived in community. This means, therefore, that we want this for each other, too. You know, we want this for the world. This hunger and thirst, and I want to talk about this word. I'm watching my time. I want us to run over this morning, but this hunger and thirst for justice, this desire, is not a passive thing. You know, we pray for it. I mean, that goes without saying, right? We pray for it, but we also work for it. We announce the gospel, and sometimes it means we have to be activists, right? Sometimes it means we have to be activists to transform society, but always with the meekness that we explored last week, that gentleness of God. It is the energy of God worked in us by living these Beatitudes that makes us rightly encounter and interact with the world. I want to say that again. Can I say that again? If I can remember what I said. I think this sums it up. It is the energy of God that is worked in us by living these Beatitudes that makes us rightly encounter and interact with the world. It's one thing to go out and claim you want justice. It's another thing to really understand what that means. So, you know, I think the most important element that I really want to talk about, and I'm going to jump to the chase here, but do you remember the parable that Jesus tells of the persistent widow? Do you remember this? Persistent widow. That she seeks justice, right? And she goes back time after time after time after time seeking this justice. Remember that? The story? And just persisted in it. And do you remember how that parable concludes?
She got her way.
She got her way? See? There we go. That's one way of looking at it. I got what I deserve. Yeah, I got what I deserve. Do you remember how the parable concludes? How Jesus ends it? Will not God grant justice to His chosen ones who cry to Him day and night? Will He delay in helping them? He says, always pray and never give up. Justice is the goal. Justice is the ideal. Always pray and never give up. Right? Hunger and thirst for it is what He's saying, and not those same words, as if your very physical life depended on it. I mean, our physical life depends on our hunger and thirst, doesn't it? Responding to those. Well, our spiritual life does too. Because this kind of hunger and thirst for the perfect justice of God is the ongoing conversion of your heart we began with in Beatitude number 1. This conversion of the heart. And inevitably means being brutally honest, remember, to know that we're not God. And we fall again and again and again to hunger and thirst for righteousness. We are driven to that. So, on a more practical note, think about this. The people that you know, when you look around at people in your life maybe, that seem to be making the most progress in their spiritual growth, are they the ones who are doing this perfectly? Are they the ones who say they're getting it right? The people that I know who seem to be making the most spiritual growth are the ones who are completely honest with themselves and others and acknowledge that they get it wrong a lot of the times. acknowledging their faults, their frailties, returning back to Beatitude number 1 with that humility, that emptiness. Remember, I said the beauty of this is that we can always start over. I said before the class, I started over, and I hadn't been up 4 hours, and I had to start over with Beatitude number 1 today. I wanted to wait 4 hours before that happened. So how many of you remember, I once said in here that trying to live one of these Beatitudes is impossible without the others. And I hope you really do see that now. So let's jump to something. Lastly, I want us to consider I'm going to do that in just a second. I want us to consider the choice of Jesus's words in this Beatitude, hunger and thirst. Can we talk about that just real quickly? That is his choice of words. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, or hunger and thirst for righteousness. Because hunger and thirst are images of essential things that we need. Right? We need food and water. Because we need them, we desire them. It's driven from a need. It's driven from a need. But sometimes, otherwise, we can become confused over what's a need or a want. Right? I need liquid. I want wine. Right? Well, water probably would be the choice. So we desire things we need, but we also desire things we want. And he's not talking about a want here. In our broken humanity, I think even though we confuse the two of these, he does not. He does not confuse them. So let's consider, and I'm jumping to the end here because I want to share with you. I want to go to the Gospel of John and end this today because, and I particularly love, I know we're not supposed to have favorite Gospels, right? I'm not dissing Matthew, Mark, or Luke in any way this morning. Each one of those narratives brings something very special and unique. But I particularly have always been drawn to John's account, and I think it's because of the beautiful and kind of simplistic language that he uses, the imagery, all the imagery he uses of light, and not that we should prefer one gospel over the other, but I just think of him. This is the historian speaking now. He's the eyewitness. If you read the Passion narrative and the account of the foot of the cross, the deposition of the body from the cross, the entombment of Christ, John is the eyewitness because he's the one that didn't run away. Okay? So, I mean, just speaking strictly as a historian, his account has got some credit as an eyewitness. He never left Jesus. St. John relates in chapter 19, verse 28. He says this. He says 2 words Jesus spoke on the cross. I thirst. I thirst. And the full context is this, because after that, aware that everything was now finished, in order that the scripture might be fulfilled, Jesus said, I thirst. Can we meditate on that for just like a half a second? I thirst. There is the physical truth for Jesus as fully human, a man hanging on that cross moments before his death, that he was depleted, dehydrated, exhausted, near death. And yes, there was a physical thirst, no doubt. But is that all? Bring me something to drink to quench my physical thirst? No, because Jesus was also fully divine. And his humanity suffered, remember? I'm going to go back to something that we hammered today. His humanity suffered so that the divine would triumph in the plan of salvation that he had already worked out for us. I thirst. That divine work was completed in the next moments when Jesus breathed his last. And what words follow I thirst on the cross? Anybody remember? It is finished. thirst, it is finished. Or, as St. Jerome renders the translation in the Latin, it more closely translates to, what I like better actually, it is accomplished. What was accomplished? The restoration of the order. The restoration of the order was accomplished. It was complete. So when Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, he means every bit of it. This is the kind of thirst we must have for his will to be accomplished. We thirst for justice, the restoration of the order. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, righteousness, for they shall be filled, sometimes translated as satisfied. 3 parts, remember, to the Beatitude. It's happy are those, the word is happy. Blessed is, that word makarios is happy. Happy are those, and then there's the state or condition that one finds oneself in, and then there is the promise. Right? Everybody remember that? That's question number 1 on your final exam, by the way. So, remember that in Beatitude 1, blessed are the poor in spirit. This is when we empty ourselves of self. We're talking about spiritual poverty so we can be humble. When we are humble, now humbled, we are able to mourn our sin, our separation from God. We become aware of our separation from God. This is letting God in, inviting God in. We're spiritually mourning because we see ourselves as we are. Beatitude number 3, aware of our own sin and strengthened by his incredible grace, we begin to be able to reflect God to others. Blessed are the meek. The meekness of God. Not weakness, remember. Meekness. The gentleness of God. And now that we can begin to mirror that perfect meekness of God to others, he tells us, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Because as we begin to reflect God to others, we naturally seek the highest principles, don't we? We naturally seek the highest principles, of which justice is obviously one. A restoration of the order is what we are to be about. Saint Teresa, Saint Teresa of Avila uses this imagery too when she talks about thirsting as if your life depended upon it. And then she says, because it does. Because it does. So, I know that some people are going to 11 o'clock Mass. We have a couple of minutes, but I do want to give out the discussion question for David's mom that's watching, right?
Jesus, thank you.
Okay. For anybody else that might want the question. But the question I want to throw out is, what does this look like? How do we thirst in the world for this kind of perfect justice that Jesus speaks of? How do we do that? What does it look like practically? Remember, there has to be a practical component to this. So what does that look like? Okay? Bye, Mom.